Hey guys, tonight we're going to unravel literally the strange, slow, sleep-worthy tale of how Persian mat weavers decided on coin border patterns. Picture this. You're standing in a warm courtyard in ancient Persia just after dusk. The air smells faintly of cardamom, dust, and sheep. Lanterns flicker. A low fire crackles beside a massive loom made from bent date palms. A man with a beard long enough to have its own opinions squints as he threads fine fibers, pulling them tight with a rhythm that's half lullaby, half prayer. You're not here for action. You're here for textiles, real edge-of-your-pillow stuff. And tonight, we're going to get to the bottom of how the simple idea of coin-inspired borders snuck into Persian mat designs and stayed for, just about 1,500 years. Now, I'll be honest, you probably won't survive this. Not from danger, but from sheer historical boredom. This is the kind of topic that would put even the most caffeinated archaeologist to sleep, which is kind of the point. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I love seeing our sleepy little global map grow. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk across creaking floorboards, your sandals making a gentle slap-slap as you approach a trio of men hunched over a half-finished mat. There's nothing glamorous here, no silk, no jewels, no high drama, just goat hair, flax, some dyed camel wool, and patience so thick it's practically a second carpet. They're not discussing revolution or romance. They're arguing very quietly about the borders, not the width, not the colors, but whether the small repeating loops around the edge should be open or closed, round or coin-like. You lean in. This, apparently, is a big deal. In ancient Persia, somewhere between 500 and 700 CE, depending on which calendar you're ignoring, mats weren't just things you wiped your feet on. They were prized possessions, gifted, traded, passed down, sometimes used as stand-ins for currency themselves, especially in remote villages. A well-made mat could outlast a marriage or two. The more ornate the border, the more wealth and status it implied. And that's where the coin design crept in. The first weavers probably didn't set out to mimic coins. It was likely more subconscious. Coins were everywhere under pillows, in shrines, sewn into tunics, round, shiny, stamped with rulers' faces or celestial lions. The shape stuck. You see a circle enough times and it starts showing up in your art whether you planned for it or not. Kind of like how modern-day fashion keeps trying to bring back cargo shorts, whether we ask for it or not. Historians still argue whether the first intentional coin motif came from a merchant commission, a royal request, or a particularly inspired fever dream involving too much fermented goat milk. But by the early 700s, we start seeing evidence of mat borders made of tiny, repeating loops sometimes braided to look like linked copper coins. Not quite circular, but enough to make you squint and think, that's either money or a very organized caterpillar. You sit cross-legged as the weavers pause to sip a licorice sweet tea. One of them gestures to a worn clay tablet, essentially an instruction guide. It's got little etched circles around the edge. Not floral, not spiral, just circles. This might be the earliest surviving design schematic for a mat border, and it looks suspiciously like someone pressed a handful of drachmas into wet clay and said, "Let's do this." Here's your first mainstream fact. Persian weaving traditions date back over 500 years, with mat and carpet making becoming formalized during the Achaemenid Empire. These weren't just household items, they were diplomatic gifts, signs of cultural prestige, and in some cases, used in ceremonial rites. And yes, a few of them had very early iterations of coin-patterned edging. Your quirky tidbit. Some weavers believed that circular border patterns protected the mat from evil spirits. Apparently, spirits, like some postal workers, can handle complex loops. So, the more intricate the design, the more ghost-proof your living room became. One elder weaver sighs and mutters something that translates loosely as, "The gods are in the borders," which, if you think about it, is kind of poetic or ominous. Maybe both. The technique for creating coin-like borders was slow and, frankly, annoying. The weaver had to loop and twist with extra care to make each rounded knot hold its shape. Some used a tiny bone needle for precision. Others just had very stubborn fingers. Either way, you realize that choosing a coin border wasn't just aesthetic, it was a flex. A way of saying, I had time. And probably back problems. By now, the fire's burning lower, casting long, soft shadows on the woven fibers. You run your fingers across the mat in progress. The texture shifts slightly at the edge where the coin motif begins. There's tension there, not just in the material, but in the meaning. As traders start drifting in from the Silk Road, stories and rumors mix in with the dye pots. Someone mentions that a noble from Sogdia paid double for mats with what he called the wealth ring. Someone else insists the circular pattern invokes Anahita, goddess of water and fertility. Another says it's just a fashionable way to frame a mat so your goat doesn't chew the corners. The fact is, no one really knows. Not for sure, and that's what makes it perfect bedtime material. You drift from idea to idea, like a breeze over wool, knowing you'll never land on a definitive answer. And honestly, you kind of don't want to. Certainty would just wake you up. As the night deepens, a weaver hums a slow, repetitive tune half lullaby, half counting mechanism. Every 10 loops, a coin-shaped bump. Every 100, a tea break. You sway slightly, your breath slows to match the pattern. Even the insects buzzing in the distance seem to move in loops. And somewhere in that quiet, a design is born not revolutionary, not royal, not even particularly practical, just a border. A ring of tiny circles whispering of trade, superstition, wealth, and repetition. Just enough to make you wonder, who decided this was the way? And how many nights like this one passed before it simply became tradition? You're still cross-legged by the loom, eyelids growing heavier with every careful knot pulled taut. The weavers haven't moved much, except to stretch their wrists or blow a stray thread from their lips. The coals are down to a soft red glow now, casting the courtyard in the kind of light that makes everything feel slower, thicker, like time's trudging through honey. One of the younger weavers, you can tell by his lack of back pain, leans over and points to the edge of the mat again. The circles are getting tighter, closer together. He squints, tongue poking out slightly, adjusting each loop like he's aligning a constellation. He's not trying to impress anyone. He's trying to get it right. And you begin to realize something. These borders aren't just decoration. They're memory. They're meaning. And somewhere along the way, coins, those everyday hunks of clinking metal, started slipping into the design subconscious of 1,000 weavers. You stretch your legs out quietly. There's a story here, and it starts with coins, literal ones. You can practically hear them in your mind. That jingle-jangle clatter echoing from bustling Persian markets, bouncing out of leather pouches, dropping onto wooden stalls, dinars, drachmas, and later, dirhams, all mingling in the hands of merchants, priests, and pickpockets. Shiny circles of value, always changing hands, always catching the light. By 600 CE, Persian trade networks are thriving. Goods flow in from India, Rome, Arabia, and beyond, and so do coins, copper from the local mints, silver from trade partners, even gold. On special occasions, though it rarely stayed long, it had a habit of traveling west, like a migratory bird with commitment issues. Now, imagine being a weaver in this swirl of movement. You don't have coins. Not really. Maybe a few, but you see them every day. They are symbols of wealth. Yes, but more than that, they're universally understood. Everyone knows a circle. Everyone sees its shine and gets the idea. This means something valuable. And so, without fanfare, circles start sneaking into border designs. At first, they're crude, bumpy, lopsided. You wouldn't mistake them for coins, but give it a decade or two and suddenly, there's a clear intention, a series of loops, evenly spaced, each one no bigger than a thumbnail, interlocking, like a bracelet, whispering, "Look, I know what wealth looks like, even if I don't have it." Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Sasanian Empire, which ruled Persia until around 651 CE, was renowned for its intricate coinage. coins bore the faces of rulers, surrounded by ornate flame-like borders. Some coins even included astral symbols, stars, moons, and sunbursts. These designs traveled just as much as the coins themselves did. Weavers, often illiterate but incredibly observant, picked up the visual cues and translated them not into currency, but into cloth. Quirky tidbit. One weaver, according to a suspiciously dramatic village tale, started hiding actual coins inside the borders of mats to save them from thieves. The mats were then accidentally sold somewhere in an ancient storage room. There may still be a dusty, rolled-up mat worth more than a camel caravan, but probably not. Still, it's a great excuse to inspect your rugs closely. Historians still argue whether the coin motifs were meant to mimic actual money or to mock it. Some believe weavers intentionally exaggerated the loop sizes to ridicule merchants who flaunted wealth. Others argue the designs weren't satirical, but aspirational visual wishes for prosperity, sewn into the very edges of everyday life. You're not sure which camp you believe. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Sipping tea and refusing to take sides, you stand up now, pacing slowly across the courtyard stones. Your sandals crunch on a few stray date pits. The stars overhead are sharp, white, and oddly coin-like themselves. You wonder, did the weavers look up? 2. Did they see the sky as another border, looping endlessly around their lives? The younger weaver reaches for a small wooden bowl and tips out a handful of coins. He sets them beside the mat not to spend, but to study. There's a rhythm to them, a pattern. Raised edges, smooth centers. Some are chipped, others worn flat from generations of palms. He presses one gently into the wool, leaving a faint indentation, and then mimics the shape and thread. This, you realize, is how it starts. Not with royal decrees, not with architecture or scrolls, but with a tired artisan squinting at a coin under lamplights, thinking, that would make a lovely border. Sometimes, the most boring revolutions are also the quietest. The weavers continue. The circles form, there's a hypnotic repetition to it, like counting sheep, but fluffier. You settle down again, head resting on a rolled cloak. The breeze tugs gently at the edge of the half-finished mat, lifting it just enough to reveal more circles. A ghost of the pattern, mirrored on the underside. Even when hidden, the motif persists. You wonder how many designs like this exist, looped, layered, threaded into objects people touch every day without thinking. A merchant sits on a coin border mat, never guessing it's an homage to his own pockets. A bride receives one in her dowry, thinking only of its softness. And somewhere, a weaver smiles faintly, knowing the real story is stitched in silence. Your body grows heavy. The weaving slows. One of the older artisans nods off, his hand still resting on the loom, as if the mat is lulling him to. You hear the rhythmic creak of wood, the whisper of wool against palm, the faint clink of a coin shifting in a bowl. And you drift a little further into the pattern. You blink slowly, still in the courtyard, though now the fire's barely more than a sigh beneath the ash. The stars above have wheeled a bit farther west, and the mat's grown longer. The border circles, those little coin echoes, form a nearly complete loop now, neat as a necklace laid out on velvet. But something's changed. The younger weaver's now frowning. He leans back, scratches the back of his neck, and mutters something under his breath too soft to catch. You edge closer and notice the pattern's ever so slightly off. One loop sits wider than the rest. A single stitch, just a breath too long. Most eyes wouldn't notice, but to the weaver, it's a flaw. And in this world, a flaw in the border can feel like a curse on the whole piece. You watch him pull gently at the thread, deciding whether to undo an hour's work or to press on. Eventually, with a sigh that probably echoes across centuries, he pulls it out. Start again, circle by circle, border by border. And as the thread unwinds, you slip even deeper into the design's evolution. See, it wasn't just about circles for the sake of circles. Over time, the motifs around Persian mat borders became layered with meaning. What began as casual mimicry, an artist's eye catching the gleam of coin, evolved into full-blown design systems. Weavers began to stylize the circles, enclosing them within floral elements, pairing them with geometric chevrons, embedding them inside braids of alternating tones. Some circles began to resemble the sun, with fine thread rays radiating outward. Others were stacked like strings of pearls, meant to represent affluence or beauty. And still others turned oddly anatomical, looking more like eyes than coins, which probably wasn't accidental. Many believed these eye coins protected the household from misfortune. After all, nothing bad can sneak in if it's being watched by 16 woven eyeballs. Mainstream historical fact. By the 8th century, textile patterns in Persia had begun influencing and being influenced by other artistic disciplines. Metalwork, ceramics, architecture. You could find the same looping, coin-inspired motifs etched into silver bowls, carved around doorway arches, and traced into tile mosaics. The borders weren't just design, they were dialogue, looping from medium to medium, carrying their quiet little message of wealth and warding. And here's your quirky tidbit. One early weaving manual, likely dictated orally and copied by hand, described a pattern called merchant's fingers. It featured interlocking loops resembling stacked coins, said to bring prosperity if woven precisely 77 times around the border. Why 77? No one knows. Could be mystical numerology. Could be a superstition born from someone having a really good market day. But here's where things get murky. Historians still argue whether the loops in these early Persian mats were meant to imitate specific coins, or just the idea of currency in general. Some scholars claim the earliest designs were modeled after Sassanian drachms, those wide silver discs with imperial faces and flaming borders. Others insist they more closely resemble Roman denarii, especially in regions where trade with Byzantium was brisk. There's even one very passionate paper arguing that the original coin motifs weren't coins at all, but stylized pomegranate seeds. And honestly, that paper kind of makes a compelling case. But you're not here to pick sides. You're here to lie back, half listening, half dreaming, as the weavers untangle a 1,000-year-old design decision that still doesn't have a clear answer. And somehow, that uncertainty is exactly what makes it soothing. The mat grows longer. The night grows softer. You trace your eyes along the border and see how the pattern repeats, but never exactly. Every loop is just a little bit different. Thicker here, tighter there, like snowflakes or fingerprints. A reminder that even repetition has variation. Even monotony has personality. One of the weavers clears his throat. Too perfect, he says. He nods to the loop the young one just corrected. We are not gods. Let it be human. And so, the next loop stays wide, left slightly off, on purpose. It's a quiet moment, but you feel it land. A deliberate flaw. A nod to humility, to imperfection, to the strange truth that beauty sometimes hides in the brokenness. Kind of like how your favorite mug always has that one chip, but you reach for it every time anyway. The weavers murmur as they work, not words. Really, just sounds like soft rain on canvas. The night insects have picked up again, offering their background buzz to the rhythm. And you're still following that border, loop after loop. Coin after coin, you begin to notice something. The pattern spirals, not in the design itself, but in the feeling of it. You start to drift, to circle, like your thoughts are following those threads, round and round. One thought bleeds into the next, just like the loops. A loop is just a journey that returns to itself. A circle is just a straight line with ambition. You remember the story the older weaver told earlier about the ghost who couldn't cross a coin border. Maybe it wasn't a ghost. Maybe it was just debt, or misfortune, or that one annoying cousin who always asks for money. Either way, the border held them out. A stitched fence against the outside world. You reach out and run a hand along the mat again. The coin loops are firm now, set in place. They're not flashy, not golden, but they whisper of value, of time. Of a slow, careful hand saying, I was here. I made this. I left a border so the world would know where I stopped. And as you close your eyes, the circle continues looping softly in the darkness, stitch by stitch, thought by thought. You stir a little as the scent in the courtyard shifts something smokier now, a tang in the air like old copper and earth warmed by fire. You blink, and one of the weavers is lifting a heavy clay lid from a small pit in the ground. Inside, dye vats, bubbling gently like soup left on too long. The youngest weaver dips a bundle of wool into a vat that smells faintly of rust and fermented fruit. You wrinkle your nose. It's dyeing day. If you thought weaving borders was tedious, just wait until you meet the art of ancient Persian dyeing, equal parts chemistry, witchcraft, and a solid chance of staining your tunic forever. You edge closer, watching them work. Bundles of thread hang from wooden poles, swaying gently in the evening breeze. Some are a deep reddish brown, like dried blood. Others are golden, dusky blue, even pale green, though those are rare and, from the looks of it, expensive. All these colors will be used to outline the coin patterns, adding depth and shimmer to the loops, so they stand out against the mat's base. But here's the twist. None of these shades come easy. Mainstream historical fact. The ancient Persians were masters of natural dyeing, using everything from crushed insects to oxidized metals to get just the right hues. Madder root gave reds. Indigo leaves were fermented for blues. Walnut husks, pomegranate rinds, even larkspur. Each had its secret color, coaxed out with the right alchemy of water, heat, and time. And here's your quirky tidbit. One village was known for using fermented sheep urine to set a particular shade of orange-brown. That's right, pea dye. It worked beautifully if you could get past the smell, which, judging by the way the youngest weaver is subtly breathing through his mouth, wasn't exactly easy. Historians still argue whether certain coin border mats had standardized dye codes, whether the outer loop color indicated region, guild, or family. Some patterns, especially those with double borders, a large coin ring flanked by a smaller one, seem to follow dye conventions. One theory suggests they acted almost like barcodes, showing where and by whom a mat was woven, even without a signature. But of course, that could also be coincidence, or fashion, or just which dye didn't run out that month. You sit beside one of the steaming vats. The air is thick and heavy, the heat rising in slow spirals. The dye master, an older woman with gray hair twisted in a bun that could probably deflect arrows, leans over the pot and gives it a lazy stir with a stick. Her hands are stained indigo to the knuckles. She catches you watching and raises a brow. Too hot for tourists. She mutters. You nod, wiping your forehead. She pulls out a length of thread. It's pale green, shimmering slightly. She inspects it, sniffs it. Why? Then nods in approval and hangs it on a drying line. You watch as the sun catches the thread, and just for a moment it gleams like oxidized bronze, just like an old coin. You can see how a weaver might look at that shimmer and think, yes, this will be my border. Dyeing wasn't just functional. It was a statement. A border in silver gray. That might suggest nobility or cool-headedness. A crimson loop. Boldness. Power, or maybe just a really lucky madder root harvest. In some areas, children were taught not to step on the coin-patterned edges of mats, especially if they were dyed black or red, because it was said to bring bad luck, or worse, offend the household spirits. The dye master shows the young weaver how to set the color, plunging the thread into a second pot, cooler, with something murky floating in it. Alum, vinegar, sheep pea again. Hard to say. She doesn't explain. She just hums quietly, letting the potion do its work. You watch the colors deepen as the threads dry, and then you spot it. 3 spools hanging side by side, one bronze, one silver gray, one gold tinged. Together, they'll outline a tri-loop coin pattern, meant to simulate depth and shadow. 3 shades for one shape. You can already imagine it, how the border will shimmer when the mat's laid out in morning light, how the loops will seem to move when walked past. It's subtle, luxurious, and absolutely unnecessary. But that's what makes it beautiful. The coin patterns weren't always literal. Sometimes they were symbolic, stylized, abstract. A weaver might use color to suggest a shimmer, a gleam, a dream of wealth rather than its representation. It was less about copying coins and more about evoking them, like humming a melody that reminds you of a song without singing the actual notes. The young weaver strings the dyed thread onto a shuttle, his fingers careful, reverent. He doesn't speak. He knows what he's handling. This isn't just thread, it's story, status, hope, twisted into fiber. You lean back again, watching as night folds fully over the courtyard. A breeze picks up, rustling the drying threads. The shadows deepen, The world narrows to the circle of firelight and the gentle hiss of dye pots cooling. The border loops wait. And now, when he picks up the loom again, the coin patterns take on color, gleaming like treasure. But made of thread, each stitch a small miracle of chemistry, tradition, and stubborn perfectionism. You follow the loop again, circle by circle, now with a glint, a hue, a shimmer that reminds you of 1,000 hands, dipping wool into dye, shaking it loose, hoping for just the right tone. The wind shifts again, bringing with it a ghost of vinegar and pomegranate peel. It's not unpleasant, just strange, old, familiar, somehow like memory. And somewhere deep in your mind, the border continues to loop, each circle not just shaped but shaded. The fire's long gone out now, leaving only embers and the occasional crackle like an old man's knees on a cold morning. But the weaving hasn't stopped. Even in the dimness, by lamplight and muscle memory, the work continues. You hear it more than see it. The low groan of the loom's frame, the soft brush of thread, the tiny clicks of fingernails adjusting wool. Tonight, you've followed borders of loops, dye, and shimmer, but now it's time to look deeper to the people who kept those borders sacred. The guilds, the mat makers' secret societies, their creeds whispered through generations, and their rules stricter than a grandma with new upholstery. You wouldn't guess it by looking at the quiet courtyard now. But mat weaving in Persia wasn't just an idle hobby, it was a trade. And like all trades, it had its hierarchy, its traditions, and yes, its very own drama. You shift on your mat as the oldest weaver clears his throat. He's not talking to anyone in particular, just the air, really, but his voice is steady. Practice. A tale told 1,000 times. There was a border master. He begins, who could weave a perfect loop blindfolded, swore by it, did it once, only once, never tried again. You're not sure if it's true, but you don't dare interrupt. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Many towns and villages in Persia had formal guilds for different types of artisans, metalworkers, potters, builders, and yes, weavers. These groups maintained quality standards, taught apprentices, and often passed down designs and techniques that never made it onto scrolls or clay tablets. If you were a mat weaver, your guild was your school, your insurance plan, and your union rep all rolled into one. But unlike the potters or the swordsmiths, weavers had an especially peculiar relationship with design. Their work wasn't always signed, but their borders, those were signatures. Specific coin loop patterns were often reserved for guild members alone. Using a restricted border motif without permission, you might as well steal someone's shoes in a bathhouse. The borders weren't just decorative, they were coded. Each guild had variations, double loops, zigzag separators, inside-out coins, the infamous broken crescent design that could get you banned from trade fairs if you weren't authorized to use it. And here's your quirky tidbit. One guild in southern Persia, according to oral tradition, would bury a single silver coin under their workshop's loom as a symbolic seed for each year's designs. They believed it kept their patterns fresh and their customers honest. It probably didn't. But you've got to admit, it's kind of poetic. Historians still argue whether these secret guild designs were actually standardized or just passed around through gossip and long, bitter arguments over tea. Some claim to have deciphered the language of the borders, believing that certain coin loop counts or arrangements indicated region, rank, or even political allegiance. Others say this is nonsense. But then again, there's a surprising amount of passion in academia for squinting at rugs. The younger weaver is now seated beside the master, listening intently. He's threading a pattern with deliberate slowness, pausing every few knots to glance at a small carved spindle. It's old, smoothed by years of hands, and etched faintly with, yes, loops, tiny, precise, almost invisible unless you're up close. A teaching tool, or maybe a warning. The older weaver nods once, approving, no words. It's this unspoken transfer of knowledge that makes the guilds so fascinating and so sleepy. You drift slightly as the air thickens with the scent of old wool, oil, and something like cedar. Your thoughts meander with a thread, from guild meetings under low arches to dusty scrolls of sketched borders, to that one apprentice who allegedly tried to reinvent the loop and got loop-shamed so badly he took up basket weaving instead. You wonder how many border motifs are lost now, forgotten in ash, buried in sand, or left behind in ruined cities. Patterns that once meant something, guilds that once guarded them like passwords. There's a story the weavers tell, low and slow, like all good sleep stories, about a master who invented a loop so beautiful, so intricate, it couldn't be copied. He called it the whisper. Only his guild knew the technique. It looked simple, but if you tried to mimic it without knowing the trick, it unraveled itself after 3 washes. Only one mat with the whisper still exists, and it's lost. Probably. You smile a little. Probably. You start to see the guild structure in the very mats themselves, how the coin borders became less about imitation and more about communication. One loop says, "I trained in the north." Another, "My master wove with dyed camel thread." A rare third loop, elongated and double-tied, might say, "I am not to be sold. I was made for a marriage." You exhale slowly, deeply, syncing again with the rhythm of the weaving. The mat's nearing completion. The loops are tighter now, confident, final. The young weaver ties off a row and leans back. He doesn't smile. Not exactly. But there's something in the way he dusts his palms that says, "This one matters." And just like that, the story returns to silence. Except for the wind, which shifts again, carrying with it a faint echo of string and song. The whispered voices of old guild masters who never needed to shout. The border holds firm. The pattern repeats, and the loop lives on. Somewhere in the dusky folds of memory, or maybe just outside the village walls, you begin to hear a different kind of story unfold. Not from a weaver this time, but from a traveler, a court storyteller, maybe, or a dusty merchant with a flair for exaggeration. You imagine him lounging in a tent, nibbling pistachios, wine sloshing slightly as he grins and says, "There once was a king who hated rectangles." And, of course, you lean in. Who could resist a king with irrational design preferences? You picture him now, a shah of modest fame but grand tastes, probably around the 9th century. Though scholars are still squabbling over which one he was, he may have ruled for a decade or maybe a long weekend, depending on the record. But everyone agrees on one thing. He had a deep, almost theatrical hatred for straight-edge designs. Historians still argue whether it was spiritual. Some say the Shah followed a sect that believed corners trapped evil spirits, just like some cultures believe mirrors steal souls. Others insist he simply found right angles boring, too rigid. He allegedly declared, while inspecting palace tiles with a disapproving squint, "Life is circular. Rectangles are lies." You're not sure what he meant, but either way, the result was the same. An edict went out. All mats made for the royal court must contain curved motifs, arches, spirals, loops, and most importantly, coin borders. That ring design, once just a stylistic whisper on common mats, now became mandatory, fashionable, royal. You imagine the panic this must have sparked in the weaving world, workshops flipping tables, apprentices crying, guild masters furiously reworking templates to include as many circular elements as mathematically possible without having their mats resemble spaghetti. One story claims the Shah's chief architect fainted upon hearing the decree. The palace blueprints were entirely rectangular. They had to be revised on papyrus. No less, a slow, painful process that involved a lot of scowling, and at least one well-documented tantrum involving a compass and a goat. The mats, though, they rose to the challenge. Suddenly, border designs bloomed. Weavers who once stuck to basic loops began experimenting. Interlinked coin patterns, petal-looped circles, even coin borders nested inside larger coin borders, like matryoshka patterns for the floor. The court loved it. And of course, once the palace embraced the style, the trend spread outward like dye through wool. Here's your mainstream historical facts. Royal patronage in medieval Persia often set design trends for decades. When a ruler favored a particular style, whether in rugs, architecture, or ceramics, it trickled down to merchants, nobles, and eventually common artisans. The Shah's preference for rounded motifs wasn't just eccentric, it redirected the aesthetic language of an entire era of weaving. Quirky tidbit. A palace mat maker named Ahram desperate to impress the circle-obsessed Shah, created a border design so round it allegedly gave court guests vertigo. The loops were graduated in size, creating an optical illusion of movement. People claimed it felt like the floor was spinning. The Shah reportedly loved it, ordered 7 more. Ahram retired soon after, possibly out of pride. Possibly because he got motion sickness every time he looked at his own work. You chuckle quietly, watching the current-day weavers work under the same moon, unaware or maybe entirely aware that they're mimicking a trend started by royal stubbornness. The mat before you now gleams faintly with triple rings of coin loops, the edges softened by the gentle fray of wool. No sharp corners in sight. It's subtle, but you can tell the weavers paid attention to curves, every corner eased. Every angle rounded. It may not be for a Shah, but it honors one just the same. You shift slightly on your cushion, letting your mind drift back to that eccentric ruler. Was he mocked in private? Almost certainly. Did he change mat design forever? Absolutely. There's something oddly comforting about that. The mat under your feet, the one collecting dust and cats and coffee spills, might have design DNA passed down from a king who just really didn't like rectangles. You wonder if other kings had equally strange preferences. A ruler who insisted on zigzags, another who wanted everything in blue, a queen who banned wool entirely because of a bad dream involving sheep. Probably. The history of design, after all, is mostly the history of personal taste turned into universal rule. And so the coin borders persisted, not just as echoes of wealth or symbols of prosperity, but as royal command, woven into domestic routine. A circle for every curve of the Shah's preference, a loop for every corner he banished. You breathe deeper now. The mat before you is finished. The loops close cleanly, the border complete. The weaver ties the final knot not with flair, not with a speech, but with a small, satisfied exhale. The kind you let out when something fits just right. He leans back, admires the rounded border. You do too. And just for a moment, you imagine a palace chamber somewhere, centuries ago, lit by flickering oil lamps, echoing with music and murmurs. And at the center, a mat like this one, its loops glowing softly under sandaled feet. You smile, eyelids heavy. The loops swirl in your mind like ripples on a pond. No rectangles, no edges, just round, endless shapes that cradle the night. A soft clang jolts your senses, just slightly, not loud, not sharp. Just a gentle metallic clatter in the dark. You open your eyes a sliver. It's the youngest weaver again, kneeling beside a cloth sack. He unties it with the care of someone unwrapping fruit in a room full of sleeping lions. Inside, coins, old ones, bent ones, a few that have holes punched through the center like little metal donuts. The boy lays them out on a low stone table, arranging them side by side, face up, like they're ancient saints or small, reluctant guests at a feast. You shuffle closer, the mat beneath you rustling. The fire's gone. But moonlight does the job now, casting a blue shimmer across copper and silver, making each coin gleam like a miniature moon. The boy doesn't speak. He doesn't have to. You can tell what he's thinking. He's looking for a pattern. And you begin to see it too. See? These coins didn't just inspire border loops, they practically designed them. The weight, the size, the embossed ridges, the subtle raised edge around the face. Even the imperfections, the small nicks and cracks gave weavers ideas about spacing and texture. Each coin was like a design stencil in disguise. Now, imagine you're a traveling weaver. Someone stitching mats near trade roads, far from the cities. You're not rich, but every few months, someone tosses you a foreign coin, a Roman denarius, a Chinese cash coin. Maybe even something so old it doesn't have a ruler's face, just stars and suns. You keep them, not because they're valuable, but because they're interesting. You press them into clay, you trace them in sand, and slowly, your borders start to borrow their language. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 10th century, Persian coinage was widely traded across the Middle East and Central Asia. Coins were minted with Arabic calligraphy, geometric flourishes, and starburst motifs designs that began showing up not just in mats, but in everything from tilework to jewelry. In many ways, coinage and crafts evolved hand in hand, each feeding the aesthetic of the other. And your quirky tidbit. One region along the Caspian coast used to embed real coins into ceremonial mats, not just stitched outlines, actual metal coins sewn into the borders. The mats were rolled up and given as wedding gifts. The idea was that the couple could spend the mat if things got rough. Of course, separating the coin from the mat meant undoing hours of weaving, so it doubled as a subtle warning. Only cash in if you really need to. Historians still argue whether early coin border motifs were about admiration or satire. Did weavers copy coins because they revered them, or because they were subtly mocking a system that kept wealth out of their hands? Some designs, especially ones with exaggerated coins so large they looked cartoonish, may have been tongue-in-cheek critiques disguised as home decor. You watch as the young weaver presses one of the older coins into a bit of wax and lifts it carefully. There, in the wax, is the edge pattern. Tiny ridges, evenly spaced, like the teeth of a very polite comb. He holds it up to the lamp. Then he begins stitching, mimicking the ridges with colored thread alternating gold and gray. The border that emerges isn't just a loop, it's a loop with texture, with rhythm, with memory. You begin to understand something. This isn't just imitation, it's translation. The weaver isn't copying a coin, he's interpreting it, turning weight into thread, turning commerce into art. Taking something cold and spendable and making it warm, woven, permanent. There's a quiet reverence to the act. Not worship, but something gentler. Like remembering an old friend. You start to drift again. The coins on the table blurring into circles of light. They shimmer just slightly. With each breath, you imagine them as tiny planets, each with its own border story. One might have inspired a triple ring mat pattern. Another, a dotted spiral used only in mourning rugs. Each coin becomes a seed, sprouting into loops that stretch across centuries. The weaver moves with care now, thread sliding through fingers like water. He's not thinking about money. Not really. He's thinking about the way the pattern will catch the light in the morning. How it will feel under a sleeping child's cheek. How, long after he's gone, someone might see those loops and think, this means something. You breathe in. Deep, slow. The night is quiet again, except for the thread's soft hiss and the occasional owl asking its rhetorical nighttime questions. The mat is half finished now, but the border's complete. And the coins, they're tucked back into the sack, resting like elders who've told their stories. And now simply listen. You shift slightly, your cheek brushing wool. The border's there, solid, circular, familiar. It no longer feels like decoration. It feels like punctuation, like the edge of a sentence you are just now beginning to understand. And somewhere in the dark, one final coin clinks softly into place right before sleep takes you again. A rooster crows in the distance, but you're not in a rush. You're still lying there, cocooned in mat and memory, listening to the faint creak of wood as someone adjusts the loom. The sky's gone that washed-out indigo that means dawn isn't far off. But the weavers, they don't seem to care. The border loops are done. But the center is its own kind of story. You sit up slowly, stretching your arms over your head. And as you do, you realize the obvious. Borders only exist because of what they frame. Coin loops. Sure. They're lovely, but they're the quiet guards at the edge of something far larger, more chaotic, more meaningful. And yet, no surprise here, those little coin-inspired borders started creeping inward. It started, like most design creep, with one bold weaver deciding the edge just wasn't enough. So instead of ending the coin loops at the mat's perimeter, they brought them into the central field, creating circular medallions, nested spirals, even full coin clusters right in the middle of a mat. They didn't look like coins exactly. Not anymore, but they had the same essence, repeating symmetry, radial balance, a sense that everything returned to the center, your mainstream historical fact. By the 11th century, Persian carpet and mat design was shifting dramatically. Central medallions, often inspired by mosque domes and celestial maps, became popular focal points. Some of these medallions borrowed heavily from older coin motifs, concentric rings, starburst patterns, even floral wreaths that mirrored decorative mintwork on caliphal dinars. And the quirky tidbit: one rural workshop, long gone now, was famous for weaving coin gardens mats with dozens of circular medallions, each meant to resemble a different type of currency. One mat from this workshop was said to have 101 coins. Unfortunately, the customer returned it, claiming it made their guests feel poor. Tough crowd. Historians still argue whether the central coin medallions were attempts to spiritualize wealth or just a natural evolution of visual symmetry. Some scholars think they had cosmic significance, the circle as the universe, the coin as a stand-in for divine order. Others think it was simply a way to break up all that boring beige wool. You lean closer now to the new mat on the loom. The weaver has begun sketching with thread, not drawing. Exactly. But outlining where the next motif will sit, you can already tell it's going to be round. Another loop, another echo, but this time, instead of copying a coin's edge, the pattern mimics its face. There is a subtle suggestion of a portrait, a figure, eyes barely indicated with a nod or two. It's vague enough not to offend religious sensibilities faces in Islamic art. Always tricky, but detailed enough to suggest someone important. Maybe it's a ruler. Maybe it's the weaver's grandfather. Or maybe, and more likely, it's just thread-playing dress-up. The weaver steps back, squinting, adjusts a line, loops the thread once more around a center pin. The image tightens. Here's the thing. When you stare at enough loops, enough concentric designs, something strange happens to your mind. You begin to feel drawn in. Your eye circles the center. Again and again. You start to lose track of where the border ends and the middle begins. The coin becomes a flower. The flower becomes a ripple. The ripple becomes thought. You lie back again, blinking slowly. The sky overhead is streaked with color now. Orange, lavender, gray. And in your mind's eye, the mat's central medallion glows faintly like an old coin freshly polished. Not for spending, not for hoarding, just for admiring. You think about how coins and carpets are similar in that way. They travel, they tell stories, they gather wear, they outlive their makers. A coin passes hands, a mat passes generations. You remember the story the weavers told last night? About the mat too beautiful to walk on. The one that was hung on a wall instead. It had a single massive coin motif right in the center. Legend said if you stared at it long enough, you'd dream of the future. Of course, some people claimed they only saw livestock prices and family arguments. But maybe that was the future. The weaver beside you adds another layer to the medallion. This one has tiny knots spiraling outward, like a stone dropped in water. The echo of a coin's rim, stretched, softened, made into thread. There's something humble about the whole process. Coins are meant to declare power, who ruled, who minted, who conquered. But in these mats, those declarations are unraveled, quieted. No inscriptions, no faces, no shiny metal, just shape and pattern. Just rhythm. And somehow, it feels more real that way. You trace the loops in your mind again. Not just the border anymore, but the whole mat does. Coins on the edge, coins in the middle, loops like breath, circles like time. A motif that means everything and nothing at once. And as the first sunbeam slips over the rooftop, catching the tip of the new medallion, you close your eyes and see it glowing, still spinning, still soft, still here. The sunlight trickles in now, gentle as tea poured from a copper kettle, bathing the courtyard in that soft golden haze that makes even dust look magical. The weavers haven't slept. Neither have you. Really, but you're not tired. Just suspended, wrapped up in wool and loops and quiet wonder. You sit cross-legged now, watching the loom from a new angle. It creaks with each pass of the shuttle. Steady as a grandfather clock, the mat grows wider, not longer this time wider, expanding outward like the rings of a tree. And you realize the border isn't just a frame, it's a boundary, a decision, a line drawn between the woven world and the barefoot one. But what if that line could shift? That's what this next part is about. Border mutations. The slow, sneaky evolution of the coin loop design as it bled into other motifs. Grew stranger, took on a life of its own. Sometimes it stayed faithful to the shape of currency, but other times it wandered. Mainstream historical fact. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Persian textile design had become incredibly diverse, especially in regions near trade crossroads like Tabriz, Nishapur, and Shiraz. Matte borders began to blend styles. Coin loops intertwined with vines, triangles nestled inside circles, and occasionally, a loop would stretch into an almond shape, evolving into what we now call the botte the paisley. Yes, you heard right. That quirky little raindrop shape on your aunt's scarf, very likely a direct design descendant of a stretched-out coin border, which makes paisley basically currency cosplay. You're welcome. Quirky tidbit. In one village, weavers used to intentionally distort the coin loops at random points along the border. Why? Because they believed that too much perfection invited envy. These wobbles were considered protective. A mat with flawless loops was bad luck. The loop had to falter, just a little, just enough to say, "Look, I'm human." You remember a loop like that from earlier, wider than the rest, left in on purpose, not a mistake, a charm. Historians still argue whether these design shifts were deliberate messages or just happy accidents. Some scholars think border mutations were subtle signals, clues about trade routes, cultural exchange, or even secret guild affiliations. Others argue it was more practical. A weaver ran out of one thread color, improvised, and called it art, which, honestly, sounds exactly like half of creative history. But whatever the cause, the result is undeniable. Over time, the neat little loops of coin borders grew wild. In some mats, the loops got tiny, packed tight like seeds. In others, they bloomed large and open, more like flowers than coins. Some took on thorned edges, others turned angular, square-ish, even hexagonal, still looping, still repeating, but more like jazz than chant. You notice now that the mat in front of you is doing the same. The current border section is no longer made of simple circles. It's something more complex, looped diamonds, with a tiny curl at each tip, almost like petals, almost like eyes, still rhythmic, still anchored, but alive. The weaver pauses, stretches his back, then dips a hand into a pouch of spools. He chooses one with a silvery thread finer than the rest, not shiny, but somehow luminous. As he works, the pattern shifts again. The loops now spiral slightly, like they're being pulled into a gentle whirlpool. It's subtle. Most wouldn't notice. But once you do, you can't unsee it. The mat is transforming, still rooted in tradition, but evolving with every stitch. You think of all the weavers who must have faced the same dilemma. Do I stay faithful to the pattern, or do I nudge it forward? Do I follow the loops I learned, or stretch them into something new? It's a question that feels bigger than weaving, and so the borders change. Quietly, loop by loop, like dialects branching from a shared language, like songs passed down through families. Each version slightly different, faster here, softer there, with one unexpected verse at the end that no one remembers adding. You lie back again, hands behind your head, and stare at the roof beams. You can almost hear the loops whispering above you. Not words, exactly, just ideas, little spirals of thought. Change is slow, they say, but it always comes, even to borders, even to thread. And as the weaver knots another line into the mat, you feel it too. The tug of history, the itch of curiosity, the temptation to try a new loop just once, just to see what happens. The sun is fully awake now, nudging its sleepy gold across the courtyard like butter spread too thick. You shield your eyes with one hand, but the mat's border draws you back down. It's become complicated, not in a messy way, but like a well-planned lie, layered, artful, slightly suspicious. The weaver's not just stitching loops anymore, he's calculating. You can tell from the way he pauses, fingers hovering mid-air, lips moving as if counting without sound. One loop, two knots, skip a line. He's laying down code, not modern code. Sure, no zeros and ones, but math. Visual math, geometry in disguise. Welcome to the secret life of symmetry. See, coin borders were never just loops for beauty's sake. They were built with rules. Quiet, Ancient rules embedded deep into the warp and weft like sacred equations. Ratios, balance, the kind of order that makes your brain whisper, yes, that looks right, without knowing why. Mainstream, historical fact. Persian artisans, especially from the 11th to 14th centuries, were profoundly influenced by Islamic geometric principles. Religious scholars and architects alike believed that the repetition of perfect form circles, stars, polygons reflected divine order, and in mat making, this spilled into everything, especially the borders. A coin loop motif might be repeated in multiples of 4, 6, or 8, forming visual tessellations that followed sacred math. Quirky tidbit. Some weavers were so obsessed with balance that they'd place a pebble or a weight under the loom to make sure it sat at a divine angle while weaving. One village tradition said a mat made on uneven ground would confuse the soul, causing dreams to spiral or guests to trip on compliments. As curses go, that one's charmingly specific. Historians still argue whether these mathematical designs were always intentional or simply evolved through trial and error. Did the weavers study architecture, or did they just follow what looked good? Some suggest that the patterns mirrored celestial maps, tying coin loops to planetary orbits. Others believe it was just the echo of 1,000 hands doing what felt right loop after loop, until the mind found peace in repetition. You watch as the weaver threads a loop into a 6-pointed star, the kind you'd expect to find carved into the lintel of an ancient bathhouse or etched around a fountain rim. It's seamless, but intricate. A loop stitched within. A star stitched within a larger loop. You blink, and it almost moves, almost breathes. Geometry has that effect. It doesn't shout. It hums. You look around the mat now and realize you're surrounded by ratios, border loops that expand slightly every 6th repeat, spirals that mimic the golden mean. Even the spacing of the knots feels calculated, like someone once sat down with a reed stylus and decided that beauty equals balance. And it works. You feel soothed, like your thoughts are aligning, circling, sinking gently into symmetry. The weaver pauses again. He shifts one pattern by a single stitch barely noticeable, but it realigns the entire sequence, like turning a kaleidoscope half a click. You gasp softly, not because it's dramatic, but because it's so satisfying. There's a kind of genius in this quiet math. The border isn't just decoration, it's structure. It's discipline disguised as softness. It holds the center in place. It keeps the chaos at bay. You think back to the earliest coin loops, simple and faithful to shape, then forward, through generations of weavers nudging those loops into vines, petals, flames, and now sacred geometry. Still looping, still repeating, but like a heartbeat now, measured, purposeful. It hits you then. This is how patterns survive. Not by staying frozen, but by folding into other systems. A coin's circle becomes a loop becomes a star becomes the grid on which a new generation of weavers rests their fingers. There's poetry in it, and math, which, if you really think about it, are sort of the same thing. You stretch out again, tracing invisible lines in the air with your finger. Lines that form circles. Circles that form hexagons. Shapes that once held coins and now hold meaning. The weaver hums to himself a low, tuneless sound, like a prayer whispered by someone who stopped believing, but still finds comfort in the words. His fingers move without looking now. The pattern is in his body. Like breath, you close your eyes, and the symmetry follows you inward. One loop, then another, then 6 more. You fall asleep counting. You awaken not with a start, but with a stretch. That full-bodied, heavy-limbed kind of stretch where your bones creak like old floorboards, and your breath comes out in a half-sigh, half-groan. The sun's crept higher now, dappling the courtyard with shadows that flicker gently through the lattice overhead. Somewhere nearby, a kettle whistles once then stops, as if it, too, has decided not to rush things today. You sit up, gaze still half-lidded, and catch sight of something new. A mat, fresh off the loom, being folded and stacked by 2 young weavers. It's beautiful. Of course, But what catches your eye is what happens next. They flip it over, the underside of the mat, suddenly exposed. Looks familiar but not quite. The coin loop border is still there, stitched carefully around the edge, but it's backward, subtler, less distinct, like a faded echo of the front design. And that's where we're going now, into the underbelly, the wrong side of weaving, where all the tension lives. You shift closer, quietly, and observe the loose threads, knots, tails, the honest mess behind the polished design. Because coin borders, as perfect as they might look from above, are far more chaotic from underneath. Mainstream historical fact. In Persian flat weave and knotted rugs, the reverse side often tells a fuller story than the front. Experts examine the back to understand tension, not count, and even the weaver's state of mind. Borders, stitched with tight consistency, suggest a calm, methodical artisan, uneven. Wandering loops might hint at fatigue or improvisation under pressure. And here's your quirky tidbit. A traveling French scholar in the 19th century wrote about a mat in Yazd that had a nearly invisible backside message woven into the coin border. When flipped, the loops spelled out a prayer backwards. The weaver, anonymous, had stitched it in reverse so only angels could read it. The mat now sits, unlabeled, in a museum basement, probably under someone's office chair. Historians still argue whether coin loop borders were ever meant to be seen in reverse. Some believe the backs held secrets codes passed between guild members, spiritual invocations, or even family jokes. Others scoff at the idea, saying it's just messy thread. But one thing's certain, every mat has two faces, and sometimes the quiet one says more. You trail your fingers lightly across the underside of the finished mat. It's rougher than the top, looser, less confident, but it's honest. You can see where the weaver paused, doubled back, started again. You can even see where a single loop was skipped, stitched too quickly, or not at all. On the front, it's invisible. On the back, a small, raw moment of humanity. And somehow, that makes it even better. You think of other coin patterns, ones no one ever flipped over. What secrets might they have held? A grandmother's initials, a birth year, a mistake turned deliberate, maybe even a name. Long erased from the front, but still clinging to the thread underneath. It hits you that we are always looking at things from the polished side, the curated one. But someone, somewhere, made it real from the inside out, with fingers sore, thread splitting, tea gone cold. And that version, the one we don't show off, is the one that holds the soul. The two weavers fold the mat carefully now, the underside tucked inside, hidden again. But you've seen it, and you won't forget. Another mat waits on the loom, half done. The loops haven't yet reached the border. The weaver's fingers work slowly, tugging at the knot, pressing it down. Moving forward, you imagine what its underside will look like when it's done. Not pristine, not perfect, but alive, full of tiny moments stitched in reverse. The wind picks up slightly, tugging at a corner of the mat stack. One edge flutters open, just enough for you to see a flash of the back again. Just a glimpse, but it's enough. One reversed loop, one crooked knot, one hidden prayer. And now you know to look. The air has taken on that warm, dry texture. That means it's approaching midday, the kind of heat that doesn't scald but swells slowly, like dough rising. You notice the weavers have shifted. They've moved under the shade, their looms now positioned to avoid the full glare of the sun. Even their shadows seem relaxed, long, blurry outlines slumped across the walls, as if they, too, are a bit drowsy from staring at looped borders all morning. But there's one weaver who hasn't moved. She's older, barely taller than her stool, and she sits with her back to a crumbling brick wall, hunched over a much smaller loom. Not a mat this time. Not even a rug. She's making something tiny. You shuffle closer, curiosity outweighing courtesy, and realize it's a miniature mat, perhaps no larger than a serving tray. It's exquisite, though every coin loop border perfect, every pattern tight and deliberate. She notices you watching and lifts her chin slightly, as if to say, yes, it's small, but it counts. And so it does. This is where we talk about practice mats. Those humble little creations that taught generations of weavers how to loop, how to space, how to read the coin patterns not as decoration, but as language, mainstream historical fact. Across Persia, it was common for apprentices to begin their training not on full rugs or mats, but on small practice weaves often gifted later as table coverings, prayer mats, or dowry items. These mini mats were where coin loop borders first became muscle memory. Repeating them over and over created not just skill, but legacy. And your quirky tidbit. One weaving school in the 18th century used to run annual coin border competitions. Students had to replicate a royal coin's edge exactly on a 12 by 12-inch practice square. Winners got a free loom shuttle and bragging rights for a year. Losers, they had to untangle the goat yarn, which, for the record, is as fun as it sounds. Historians still argue whether these practice mats were ever intended to survive. Most were functional, given away, repurposed, even cut up to patch garments. But every so often, one appears in a private collection framed like a painting. And always, the coin loop borders are flawless. Not because the weaver was perfect, but because the weaver tried. You glance back at the older woman. Her fingers tremble slightly, but she's fast. Her threadwork flows without hesitation. You can tell she's done this before, thousands of times. Maybe since childhood. Her mat features a classic double coin border, 2 loops twined like wedding rings, spaced evenly around the edge. Inside, a simple flower, nothing flashy, just clean, calming symmetry. She notices you squinting and, with a rare flicker of amusement, leans forward and points to one corner. You lean in too. There, almost invisible, is a third loop. Tiny, hiding in the negative space between the outer two, not part of the design. Intentional. You raise your eyebrows. She smiles, shrugs, keeps weaving. You've just witnessed what some call a whisper loop, a barely there addition to a coin border, slipped in like a wink, like a footnote. Like an inside joke passed down silently from master to apprentice. These whisper loops weren't mistakes. They were signatures, not written with ink, but with intent. Some indicated the region the weaver came from. Others marked the mat as part of a personal gift. One theory, whisper loops were sometimes used to signal romantic interest, which, honestly, might explain why some mats had as many as 12. You run your fingers across the old woman's nearly finished piece. It's soft, tightly woven, warm from the sun. The loops feel like braille, like a story you almost remember. She cuts the final thread with a small blade worn smooth by years of use. The mat is done. It's not big. It's not bold. But it's perfect. And as she folds it in half and tucks it into a satchel, you realize something. These small mats might be the purest form of the coin loop tradition, not diluted by client demands, not warped by palace trends, just thread, hands, and memory. You look around the courtyard. Mats large and small lie stacked, drying, waiting. But your eyes drift back to that satchel, where a whisper loop now rests, quiet and unseen. There's something deeply comforting about that. Not all borders are made for walls. Some are made for laps, for prayer, for shelves that don't match anything else, for homes where someone says, "Oh, that old thing," and smiles like it means everything. You settle back again, head resting on folded arms, eyes drifting towards the fluttering edge of a drying mat. You'll never look at small rugs the same way again. The mat beneath you is quiet now, not silent. Nothing here ever really is, but quiet in the way an old book is quiet. Even as the pages hum with stories, you breathe in the scent of wool and dust and tea and time itself. It's grounding. The kind of stillness that lets your mind drift backward without warning. And just like that, you're thinking of myths, because if coin loop borders have changed so much across centuries shaped by rulers, menders, geometry nerds, and superstitious aunties, what do the legends say? What about the ones who didn't just stitch these patterns, but claim they invented them tonight or, well, this afternoon? Now we step into the strange world of weaving myths and folklore, where coin loops weren't just inspired by real money, but by divine inspiration, wild omens, and on at least one occasion a snake with exceptional taste. Your mainstream historical fact: Persian folklore, especially in the provinces surrounding Yazd, Kashan, and Kerman contains dozens of weaving legends. Some are clearly metaphorical origin stories about the loom as a gift from the gods, or patterns whispered by angels. Others blur the line between craft and mysticism, attributing mat patterns, especially border designs, to dreams, spiritual visitations, and even jinn. The coin loop border has its fair share of myth. Naturally, one tale, told in various forms, centers on a widow named Marjam who wove a mat for 7 nights straight, guided by the rhythm of coins dropping in her dreams. Each morning, the loop she stitched matched exactly the size of coins she'd never seen. The villagers claimed the mat was cursed. A merchant claimed it was a map. A local goat just chewed the corner off and fell asleep. And here's your quirky tidbit. In one remote village near the edge of the Dasht-e-Kavir desert, it's said that the looped border of an ancient mat contains a prophecy woven so skillfully it only reveals itself under starlight. Naturally, this has led to countless old men dragging mats into moonlit fields, squinting at wool while their wives sigh heavily from doorways. Historians still argue whether these stories have a factual core. Some think they're metaphors for social dynamics, women gaining power through artistry. Others believe they're invented by merchants to drive up prices. Yes, this mat is blessed by a firebird. Only 30 extra dinars. But even the skeptics agree. Folklore influences design. A weaver who believes their pattern wards off evil is going to weave with a different kind of hand. You let that thought settle. You imagine Marjam, alone in her stone home, the fire crackling low, her fingers working furiously by feel. She isn't thinking about history. She's thinking about grief, about feeding her daughter, about how a mat might be more than wool. It might be a message, a prayer, a spell. And when the final loop snaps into place at dawn, she sleeps for 3 days straight. When she wakes, the loops are done and the legend begins. Coin borders, you realize, are the perfect medium for mythology. They are circular, repetitive, infinite, like wheels, like halos, like the kind of symbol that begs to be given meaning. A weaver stitches 50 loops around a mat, and some wandering poet says, one for each year of our king's reign. Another says, no, those are the tears of the prophet's lost horse. And a third just smiles and whispers, they mean whatever you need them to mean. There's one more myth you remember now, a tale barely told anymore, about a jinn imprisoned in a mat. Not in the center, as you might expect, but in the border, trapped between the loops, each knot tightened like a lock. The mat had to be unrolled every new moon to keep the jinn calm. One night, a merchant forgot and his entire house filled with scorpions the next morning. Coincidence? Maybe, but his wife never forgot again. You look down at your own feet, resting near the edge of the repaired mat. The loops don't seem threatening, but who's to say? Maybe the pattern isn't just there to please the eye. Maybe it's keeping something in or keeping something out. You chuckle softly, brushing the thought away like a fly, not because you don't believe it, but because you kind of do. And somehow, that makes it better. You glance around. The courtyard is still, but the mats around you whisper stories. Borders that mean wealth. Borders that mean hope. Borders that mean, don't mess with me unless you like itchy feet and bad dreams. And in the middle of it all, you lie back once more, eyes tracing loops into clouds above. Every mat is a myth. Every loop, a legend. And if you fall asleep and dream of coins raining from the sky, well, don't be surprised if you wake up weaving. The light begins to soften again. Afternoon has slipped into early evening without asking permission, and the courtyard has taken on that syrupy hush, like the world's holding its breath just before dinner. The weavers are slowing down, not stopping. Of course, never stopping. But their movements have shifted from work to ritual. Fewer knots, longer pauses. One man sips something from a chipped cup and squints at his mat like it just told him a riddle. You sit up straighter, brushing some thread fluff off your shoulder. You've learned a lot today about coin loops and symmetry, prayer mats and whisper loops, jinn and goat-related catastrophes. But there's still one thing gnawing at you. Who decides what's real? Because if you've been paying attention, and I know you have, you've noticed that these borders aren't consistent. Not across regions, not across centuries, not even across weavers in the same family. One sister stitches a border with tight Roman-style coins, each one identical, the other soft oval loops, uneven on purpose, with small heart shapes motifs hidden in the corners. Which one is the correct version? That's what this section is about. Regional differences in coin loop borders and the weavers who dared to disagree. Mainstream historical fact. As Persian trade expanded along the Silk Road and beyond, local weaving traditions adapted and merged. A coin loop border from Western Iran might look wildly different from one on the Afghan border. In Tabriz, loops were often sharp and geometric angular coins, crisp outlines. In Kerman, softer curves, more floral interpretations. The loop was still there, but it spoke with a different dialect. And your quirky tidbit. One town near Hamadan is known to this day for its so-called squashed coin border, a motif that looks like someone stepped on a stack of dinars. Locals claim the shape honors a wealthy merchant who sat on his fortune literally and dented his entire coin pouch. Historians are skeptical. The town's carpet sellers are not. Historians still argue whether these regional styles reflect meaningful cultural distinctions or just aesthetic drift. Some scholars believe certain border shapes represent alliances or shared trade routes, visual shorthand for who exchanged what with whom. Others think it's less political and more personal. The way one village likes its tea stronger, its gossip louder, and its coin loops a little more flamboyant. You lean against a cool stone wall now, eyeing the finished mats stacked nearby. One is stiff and formal, border loops like marching soldiers. The next is dreamy loops so subtle you barely notice them unless the light hits just right. Same motif, same tradition, but each mat sings a different song. You begin to see the pattern behind the patterns. Regions matter, yes, but so do people. One master weaver might pass on a specific loop technique that becomes the local style, just because she taught 30 students before retiring into a rose garden. Another village might lose its signature design entirely after a flood wipes out the loom house and the old men forget which way the thread was meant to twist. Culture isn't a monument, it's a pot of stew. Every generation adds something, takes something, burns something, sweetens something else. You remember something one of the weavers mumbled earlier, half asleep, half joking? Borders lie. At the time, it sounded philosophical. Now, it feels like a thesis, because when someone says, "This is the classic Persian coin loop design," what they really mean is, "This is the one I like best." Or, "This is the one that sold well in 1837. Or maybe, "This is the one my mother taught me." And that's reason enough. You run a hand along one mat's edge. The loops are bold, irregular, clearly regional. You couldn't draw them from memory, but you know exactly how they feel. Intentional, proud, local, like someone whispering their hometown dialect even after moving across the country. And here's the quiet truth. There is no definitive coin loop border. There never was. What exists is a conversation across time and terrain. A million hands trying, failing, adjusting, passing it on. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine all the weavers across the centuries. One in a breezy workshop near the Caspian, another in a cramped city room with low ceilings and a tea stain spreading dangerously close to the wool stash, another still in exile, weaving from memory on foreign looms, trying to remember, was the loop before or after the knot? You open your eyes again. It doesn't matter. The loop survives, not unchanged, but alive, breathing, stretching, reshaped by river and road and argument. And you're part of it now. 2. You'll walk away from this courtyard with your own favorite version. Maybe it's the double loop. Maybe it's the squashed merchant coins. Maybe it's that weird reverse pattern you can only see in starlight. Whatever you choose, it's yours. Because the border never really belonged to kings or curators. It belonged to weavers. And now, maybe, a little bit, to you. Evening has arrived in full now. The air's cooled down. And everything feels slower, softer. Somewhere in the distance, a nightbird trills uncertain, testing the silence. The courtyard is emptied a bit. The younger weavers have gone home. A cat tiptoes across the half-finished mat like it owns the place it does. A kettle whistles once, then twice, then quiet. You're still here. And so is the loom. The final coin loop border of the day is nearly complete. The weaver's hands move slower now, not because they're tired, but because the end of a mat demands reverence. Every thread has to close the story just right, like the final sentence of a poem, or the last circle drawn on a child's map. You sit close, quietly, watching. This last bit is always the same. Secure the loops, tuck the ends, tighten the edge, and there is your final border. A soft row of shapes that may have once stood for silver, or symmetry, or maybe just the way the moon looked that night. You've made it to the end of the journey. But before we let it all fade into dreams, let's wrap the thread neatly around the spindle. Let's look at what these border loops really mean. Mainstream historical fact. Today, collectors and historians categorize coin loop borders by era, region, and style, drawing hard lines where the weavers themselves may never have. Museums often display these mats behind glass, with placards that mention symbolism, commerce, aesthetic conventions. But few mention the long nights, the stiff fingers, the loop that went wrong 3 times before finally sitting still. Quirky tidbit. There's an old saying, part joke, part truth, that no 2 coin loop borders are ever exactly alike, not even from the same weaver. Supposedly, a mat with a perfect repeat is cursed to unravel on the coldest night of winter. Why? Because perfection doesn't belong to mortals. Even your borders need one bad loop just to prove they came from here. Historians still argue whether the coin motif itself was ever meant to last. Some claim it was a placeholder for something else, a symbol misinterpreted and repeated so long it took on a life of its own. Others argue it was always what it seemed, a nod to wealth, a loop of order, a little thread-stitched nod to civilization's great glittering lie. You look at the finished mat now, its border glowing in the low light. It's not just coins, it's resistance. Each loop is a refusal, a quiet, looping act of defiance that says, I was here, I made this. I repeated myself not to conform, but to be remembered. A coin is meant to be spent, but a loop is meant to stay. You take one last walk through the courtyard. Your bare feet brush the edges of a dozen mats. You pass thick borders, thin ones, jagged loops, loops stitched too tight and too loose, patterns that whisper and others that shout. One mat has a border that looks suspiciously like teeth, another, waves, and another still a perfect circle, broken only once. By a single red stitch, you smile, you sit again, one last time, beside the loom where the weaver has finally stopped. He leans back, crosses his arms, says nothing. But he knows. And now, so do you. The coin loop border was never about the coins. It was about keeping the world at bay. It was about holding something in place even if just for a little while. It was about the space between repetition and meaning, between silence and craft, between sleep and memory. And now, it's time. So you lie back, on a mat made of loops and myths and questions. The threads hum around you, gentle and warm. You don't count them. You don't trace them. You just drift, wrapped in borders that don't bind, held by patterns that never needed to make sense. And slowly, softly, you sleep. The loom is still now, the courtyard quiet, even the cat has vanished, maybe off chasing moths in another story. The final coin loop glows faintly in the low light, soft and secure. You feel your body getting heavier, like it's slowly melting into the mat beneath you. Your shoulders settle. Your breathing slows. Every part of you is wrapped in something ancient, threaded through with stories and rhythms you don't need to understand to feel. The world narrows gently, the way it does when you're almost asleep. Every sound fades. The rustle of cloth, the hush of breeze against clay walls, the subtle creak of a loom resting after a long day. They all slip into the background like waves pulling away from the shore. You imagine the loops now, not the ones on the mat, but the ones inside your mind. Thoughts curling inward, spiraling softly, repeating just enough to calm you, to cradle you, to lead you toward that perfect, quiet stillness. You don't need to remember every pattern, or fact, or story. You only need to know they were real, and that now, they're yours. So let yourself drift. Let the border fade. Let the night close gently around you like a final loop drawn with care. The mat will hold you, the loops will wait, and sleep will come.